I have known Edmund Ashcroft, the Duke of Renshaw, for 23 years, and in all that time I have never seen him wrong-footed by anything. Not a parliamentary defeat, not a horse that threw him, not the death of his father which left him with a dukedom and a debt's ledger at the age of 22. He managed all of it with the same carved composure, the same cold arithmetic of duty, the same Renshaw face that his mother always said was worth more than most men's entire fortunes. Edmund wore it like armor because it was. Which is why, when Miss Cecily Randall unmade him in 4 days, I found myself sitting in the east drawing room of Renshaw Hall at 11 o'clock in the evening, watching the fire and thinking, I should have brought a note-taker. I will tell you what happened from the beginning because it deserves telling properly, and because Edmund will never tell it himself. He is the sort of man who permits the truth of his own defeat only in private, and only to me, and even then grudgingly. But it happened. It is the truest thing I know about him, and the best. The house party at Renshaw Hall that October was his mother's arrangement. The Dowager Duchess Margrave, a woman who ran the social machinery of 3 counties with the precision of a Swiss clockmaker, had invited 11 guests for a fortnight, ostensibly for the autumn shooting, but in practice for the purpose of finding Edmund a wife. He was 36. She had been trying for 8 years. He had resisted with the same expression he brought to parliamentary debate and a state account review. A calm, immovable refusal that was never rude, but was always final. I arrived on Tuesday afternoon and found Edmund in the library reading dispatches, apparently unaware a house party was occurring around him. I told him I had passed 3 carriages on the drive. He told me he knew. I asked if he intended to appear for dinner. He said he intended to appear for every meal and every arranged amusement, as his mother had requested, and that this constituted the entirety of his obligation. Then he went back to his dispatches. Miss Cecily Randall arrived on Wednesday morning with her aunt, Mrs. Plumtree, a cheerful, wheezing woman who considered Renshaw Hall a great opportunity, and said so 3 times before luncheon. Cecily said nothing about opportunity. She said something, at the lunch table, about the walled garden, which she had apparently noticed on the drive up, and asked if it was still producing kitchen herbs this late in the season. The head gardener, old Duff, who happened to be passing the window, heard her through the glass and looked startled, because she had named the right varieties for late October by climate and soil type, and Duff knew a thing or two about late-season herbs. I watched this happen. Edmund, who was seated across from her, looked at her once, briefly, with the expression of a man who had not expected to have to look at someone twice. That, as far as I could see, was where it began, not at dinner, at the lunch table over the question of rosemary in cold ground. Dinner on Wednesday evening, however, was where it acquired its famous shape. There were 12 of us at the table, and the Dowager had arranged the seating with her usual surgical intention. Cecily placed 3 chairs to Edmund's left, close enough to be visible to him, far enough that he would not feel managed. Lady Featheridge, who was 20 and lovely and the daughter of a marquis, sat at his right. Edmund spoke to Lady Featheridge with the courtesy that he applied to all social obligations, correct, attentive, and entirely absent. He asked her about her family's estate in Somerset. She answered at length. He nodded. Then Mrs. Plumtree, meaning well, leaned across the table and said something about how Cecily had an opinion on everything, and that this had caused some difficulties with certain gentlemen she had been introduced to in town. She said it in a fond, apologetic way, the way one apologizes for an eccentric heirloom. Edmund looked up. He looked at Cecily. She was eating her soup with a composure so perfect it might have been boredom. "It is generally the case," Edmund said, "and I will tell you exactly what he said, because I remember every word, and because he later made me swear to repeat it to no one, which promise I am now breaking in the service of accuracy, that no man wants a wife with opinions. An opinion in a woman is generally a sign that she has been allowed to read too widely and listen too little." He said it in his usual tone, which was the tone of a man observing weather or the price of grain. Not cruel, not pointed. Simply stated the way his father had stated such things, the way Renshaw Hall stated such things in every cold corridor and high-ceilinged room. The table went quiet. Lady Featheridge looked at her hands. Mrs. Plumtree began to apologize for something. Lord Hartwell, on my right, began to study his wine. Cecily put down her spoon. She looked at Edmund with an expression I had difficulty categorizing, which I later decided was a kind of clinical interest, the look of someone who has found a specimen worth examining. "Your Grace," she said, "may I ask which opinion of mine has caused you difficulty? I should like to know so I may have it correctly." Edmund looked at her. "You have not given me one yet." "Then," she said pleasantly, "you are objecting to opinions in principle rather than mine in particular, which seems a rather general complaint to level at a dinner table. I wonder if you have found it effective." The silence had a different quality now. "Effective," Edmund said, in a tone that was not quite a question. "As a discouragement," she said, "of the opinions, I find that broad pronouncements on what one wants rarely achieve the thing." She picked up her spoon again. "But perhaps it works better than I imagine. I have not tried it." Edmund said nothing. I have seen Edmund in the House of Lords, facing men who have spent decades learning to make other men feel small. I have seen him in a card room with a losing hand and not a flicker. I have never seen him silenced at a dinner table by a woman eating consommé. He said after a moment, "You argue your point before I have stated mine." "You stated it, Your Grace," she said. "That no man wants a wife with opinions. I simply asked a follow-up question. A follow-up question is not an argument, it is a courtesy. Though I recognize the distinction may not always be welcome." Lord Hartwell coughed. The Dowager at the far end of the table was watching her son with an expression I had also never seen on her face, which was hope. Edmund picked up his fork. "Your follow-up question," he said, "contained an embedded argument." Cecily tilted her head. "Did it? Which one?" "That broad pronouncements are ineffective." "That was an observation, not an argument, though I note," she added, "that you have remembered it exactly, which suggests it landed somewhere." She said this without a smile, which made it worse for him. A smile would have been a weapon. The lack of one was something else. Edmund looked at her for 3 full seconds, which, for Edmund, is an eternity of visible attention. Then he looked away and returned to his dinner. But I saw his face, and I know that face, and what was on it was not irritation. It was something I had not seen there before, and it would take me 2 more days to name it. Thursday morning, Edmund appeared in the walled garden at 9:30. This was unusual. Edmund did not appear in gardens. He appeared in libraries, in the estate office, on the hunting field, and in the stables, in descending order of preference. Gardens were his mother's territory. Cecily was already there with her sketchbook, examining the late-season kitchen beds she had asked Duff about at lunch the day before. Duff was with her, and they were in conversation, and I observed through the gate, being of a naturally curious disposition, that they were discussing the behavior of time in frost, which is not a fashionable topic, but is apparently one on which Cecily held views. Edmund stopped when he saw her. He then, and I watched this, continued into the garden, because stopping would have been an admission. "Miss Randall," he said. She looked up. "Your Grace." "You were up early." "I find mornings useful," she said. "And the frost this morning made the garden particularly worth seeing. The sage has gone quite silver." She showed him the page of her sketchbook, which had a rapid, confident drawing of the sage bed with the frost on it. She held it up in the way of someone who expects the recipient to look at it, not to admire it. Edmund looked at it. "You draw well," he said. "I draw accurately," she said. "It is not the same thing, but it serves better for my purpose." "Which is?" "To remember what I've seen. I forget things I do not write down or draw. I find I remember almost everything I sketch." She closed the book. "Do you have a practice like that?" Edmund did not have a practice like that. Edmund had the particular memory of a man who has spent 20 years treating his mind as a filing cabinet and never loses a figure once he's looked at it. He said, "No." "That must be convenient," she said pleasantly, and turned back to the herbs. Edmund stood in the walled garden for another 7 minutes. I know because I counted. He asked her 3 more questions, about the sketch, about whether she planned to walk that afternoon, about the variety of the late mint that had persisted against the wall's warmth. She answered them all in the same manner, directly, without performance, with the occasional unexpected return question that he could not quite anticipate. When he left, he walked in the direction of the stables, which was not where he had been going, and I noticed that he had not once looked at his pocket watch, which with Edmund is a reliable indicator of whether he considers his time being wasted. He considered a great deal of time wasted. He checked his pocket watch in the House of Lords. He checked it at dinner parties. He had never once checked it during a conversation with Cecily Randall, and there would be 2 more full days of those conversations, and the watch would stay in his pocket throughout. That evening, Duff told me, unprompted, that Miss Randall knew more about cold ground cultivation than any woman of quality he had ever spoken to, and that she had asked the right questions, which was rarer than knowledge. I told Edmund this at billiards. He did not look up from his shot. "She asked questions at dinner too," he said. "Different sort of questions," I said. He made his shot. "She corrected me," he said. "She asked a follow-up question. She said so herself." Edmund looked at me. "You found it amusing." "I found it," I said carefully, "instructive." I sank my own ball. "You haven't been corrected since Eton." "I am not corrected now," he said in the tone that meant he was thinking about something else. He set up his next shot. "She was not wrong." I put my cue down. "I beg your pardon." "A broad pronouncement," Edmund said, "applied at a dinner table to a woman one has never spoken to is in fact generally ineffective. She was not wrong." He made his shot. "It was also inaccurate on its own terms. My father said it. I repeated it without examining it." This was the most astonishing thing Edmund Ashcroft had said to me in 23 years, and I had the sense to say nothing at all, which is rarer for me than knowledge. Friday was the shooting day. Edmund was in his element: horses, open fields, the cold precision of it, and Cecily did not shoot, of course, but she walked with the group in the way of a woman who has been outdoors enough to know how to manage a muddy October field in a walking dress without difficulty and without complaint. She wore sensible boots, which the Dowager noticed and approved of with a small nod she thought no one saw. She observed everything. She asked a gamekeeper named Bryce about the habits of the particular partridge in the lower fields, the coveys, the flight patterns, the cover they preferred in October frost, and was given a full 15-minute answer, which she listened to with entire attention and 3 follow-up questions, after which Bryce told Lord Hartwell he thought she was the most sensible visitor they'd had in 7 years. Edmund shot well, as he always did, 3 for 3 in the first drive, which was better than anyone else in the party, and achieved with the same composed economy he brought to everything. And I watched him not watching her, which was its own kind of watching. He never turned toward her. He was always aware of exactly where she was. At luncheon on the field, taken from hampers in a clearing, she sat near the edge of the group with her sketchbook again, and Edmund, after distributing the conversation to the rest of the party with the host's precision, drifted to the edge of the group. Sat near her, not next to her. 2 feet away, facing a slightly different direction, in the way of a man who has a reason to be in that area of the clearing that has nothing to do with her. "You were not bored," he said after a while. She looked up from her sketch, which appeared to be of the beech trees at the clearing's edge. "By the shooting? No. Most women find it tedious." "I found it interesting," she said. "The coordination of it. The way the line moves." She showed him the page. She had sketched the line of shooters in rapid notation, capturing the spacing and the motion of it. "I was trying to get the geometry right." Edmund looked at the sketch for a long time. "The angle is slightly off on the left flank." She looked at it, tilted her head. "You're right," she said, and corrected it with 3 quick strokes. "Better." "Yes," he said. They sat with that for a moment, the corrected sketch between them like a small treaty. "You don't mind being corrected," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I mind being wrong more than I mind being corrected," she said. "The correction is useful, the wrongness just sits there otherwise." She closed the book. "You don't mind being challenged, I think." Edmund looked at her. "Most people assume I do." "Yes," she said. "I noticed they didn't try it at dinner." She said it without particular emphasis, the way she said most things, as an observation, not a barb. "You tried it." "I asked a follow-up question," she said, for the second time, with the smallest edge of private amusement that she did not quite hide. "I am still maintaining that distinction." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "My father said it," he said. "What I said at dinner, it was the kind of thing he said." She looked at him, a direct, steady look, not challenging, not soft, simply present. "Was he right about most things?" "About the estate," Edmund said. "About the land, about duty," he paused. "About other things, less so." "It is hard," she said, "to sort which parts of a father's voice are his and which have become one's own." Edmund looked at her for a moment with an expression I couldn't read from my position 10 yards away, but which I later understood had been something like recognition. Yes, he said. They sat there in the clearing until the party began to stir again, 2 feet apart, not speaking much more, and I had the acute sensation of watching something large move very quietly, the way a river moves when there is no current visible on the surface. Saturday brought rain, which kept the party indoors, and indoors at Renshaw Hall with nothing to do was harder than outdoors for most people, because Edmund had never installed the kind of drawing room entertainment his mother favored. There were no card tables arranged with hope, no musical instruments wheeled forward. There was a library, which Edmund used, and a billiard room, which he shared with the men, and a morning room his mother had arranged for the women, and that was the general geography of a wet Saturday at Renshaw. Except that Cecily was in the library when Edmund arrived at it after breakfast, because Cecily had identified the library on Tuesday evening and considered it hers by reasonable right. She was at the window table with a volume she had evidently found on the agriculture shelf, which was the least visited shelf in the library and the one Edmund considered most essential. She looked up when he came in, registered his surprise, and said, "I've been reading about drainage systems in the eastern counties. Your annotated copy is quite interesting. You disagree with the author on clay composition." Edmund stood in the doorway of his own library. "You read the marginalia," he said. "Of course," she said. "The marginalia are usually the best part." She showed him the page, his own narrow annotations from years past, the disagreements he'd had with the author's methodology, the figures he'd checked against Renshaw's own drainage records. "Were you right?" He came to look at the page, which meant standing beside her at the window table. He looked at the annotations. "In the main," he said, "his clay figures were derived from Surrey composition, not the eastern counties, different drainage rate." "I thought so," she said. "The numbers didn't reconcile with what Duff told me about the lower fields." She looked up at him. He was standing very close because the window table was narrow and the page was between them. "Would you show me the Renshaw drainage records? I should like to see whether the new system performed as you expected." Edmund went to the estate shelves without a word and brought back 3 bound ledgers, the kind of ledgers that told you everything about Renshaw Hall that no painting ever had, the true records, the actual work. He set them on the table. He sat down across from her, not beside her, across, the full width of the table between them, which was the correct distance and the right thing, and also, I suspected, the hardest position to maintain. And he opened the first ledger and began explaining the drainage system, and she read with him, asking questions, pointing at figures, finding the places where the theory and the execution had diverged and noting them with the same pencil she used for her sketchbook. She had 3 pages of notes by noon. Edmund added to them his own figures, cross-referenced from memory, which she wrote down without making anything of the fact that he had retained the numbers from a drainage project completed 6 years ago. She simply wrote them down as if it were natural, which it was for Edmund, but no one had ever treated it as simply natural before. Most people were either daunted by it or performed being impressed. She did neither. She used the figures. They spent 2.5 hours together while the rain came down, and the rest of the party played cards and looked out of windows. I know because I went looking for him at 10:30 and saw them through the library door, heads bent over the same ledger in the gray morning light, and kept walking. That evening at dinner, Edmund spoke to her from his end of the table, a thing he had never done across the full dinner table to anyone who was not his mother or a senior statesman, about a question she had raised regarding the drainage timing relative to the winter wheat. The rest of the table listened with expressions ranging from polite bafflement to open admiration, depending on their own relationship to agricultural drainage. Lady Featheridge, at his right, quietly stopped existing. Sunday morning, Cecily came down to breakfast to find her aunt already dressed for departure. The visit had been contracted for 3 days. Mrs. Plumtree had another engagement in town, and the carriage was ordered for 11 o'clock. This was known, or should have been known, and Cecily knew it. She had packed the night before. I was in the breakfast room when she came in. She ate her breakfast with the same composure she brought to everything, spoke pleasantly to 2 of the other guests, and did not make anything of the leaving. Edmund came in at 8:30, as he always did, and stopped when he saw the hat and gloves Cecily had set on the side table, traveling clothes, not walking clothes. "You are leaving," he said. "This morning," she said. "Mrs. Plumtree has an engagement in town." Edmund looked at the hat and gloves for a fraction longer than was natural, then sat down and poured his coffee with perfect composure. He spoke to Lord Hartwell about the previous day's weather. He passed the bread. He was entirely himself and entirely elsewhere simultaneously, which was a thing I had seen him do in the Lords during difficult votes. At 10 o'clock, Mrs. Plumtree was in the hall supervising the trunks. Cecily was in the walled garden. I know because I followed her. She was standing at the herb bed she had sketched on Thursday, looking at it in the way of someone committing a thing to memory without a sketchbook, and I thought of what she had told Edmund, that she drew things to remember them. "Miss Randall," I said, "I am going to say something impertinent." She turned. "You seem like the sort of man who does," she said pleasantly. "Edmund is an idiot," I said. "He knows he is an idiot. He requires approximately 12 more minutes to do something about it, if you could find reason to be in the garden for 12 more minutes. She looked at me with those direct, measuring eyes. "Lord Vane," she said, "I am not in the habit of remaining somewhere for the benefit of a man who cannot decide in a timely way whether he values my company." "No," I said, "you're not. But he has valued it since Wednesday morning and has been arguing with himself about it ever since, and I know Edmund Ashcroft, and I am telling you that if you get into that carriage, he will stand in the hall and watch it go and not say a word, because that is what duty looks like on a Renshaw man when it has beaten out sense. And then he will be absolutely insufferable for 6 months, and I will have to hear about it." She studied me. "That," she said after a moment, "is a very persuasive argument." She turned back to the herb bed. She was still in the garden 8 minutes later when Edmund came through the gate. I know because I had taken up a position against the kitchen wall with a view of both the gate and the herb bed, and was thoroughly violating any reasonable standard of gentlemanly behavior, but I considered it a necessary service to history. He came through the gate quickly, in the way of a man who has argued himself out of an argument with himself, which is the only way Edmund ever moved quickly toward anything that wasn't a horse or a fire. He stopped when he saw her, and she turned at the sound of the gate, and they looked at each other for a moment across the frost-silvered sage she had sketched on Thursday morning. "You have opinions," he said. She waited. "About drainage systems," he said. "About rosemary and cold ground, about the inefficacy of broad pronouncements, about time in frost and the geometry of a shooting line." He stopped. He was not a man who had ever done this before, and it showed not in weakness, but in the particular honesty of a man who has run out of armor and found he doesn't need it. "You have opinions about my own marginalia that are better than mine." "The drainage question," she said carefully, "was genuinely arguable." "You were right," he said. "And I was what I said at dinner on Wednesday was my father's voice, not mine. I have been sorting out what is mine." He met her eyes. "You asked me on Friday whether he was right about most things. I have been thinking about it since." "And he was right about duty," Edmund said. "He was wrong about this." He gestured between them, a spare, careful gesture, the kind of gesture a man makes when words have reached their limit. "About whether a man wants a wife with opinions, I have established conclusively over the last 4 days that I do, that I specifically and only want this one." He paused. "Which I recognize is a faster conclusion than decorum recommends." She looked at him. Her expression was the one I had watched across 4 days of dinners and mornings and library tables, direct and present, and giving nothing away that she didn't choose to give. "It is Sunday," she said. "Yes," Edmund said. He didn't look away. "I said at dinner that no man wants a wife with opinions. I have come to correct that. I am asking you to marry me, Miss Randall. Not as Renshaw, not as the unyielding Duke, not in any capacity that my father's voice dictated. As Edmund Ashcroft, who has spent 4 days in argument with the most interesting woman he has ever met, and who is aware that this is an extremely imperfect proposal made in a frost-bitten kitchen garden on a Sunday morning, and who is asking anyway." He stopped. He waited in the way of a man who has said everything he has to say and has no more armor and knows it, and is standing there without it. Cecily looked at him for a long, level moment. The sage was silver around her. The kitchen garden was perfectly still. "The proposal," she said at last, "is better than the dinner remark." "I should hope so." "And you understand," she said, "that I will continue to have opinions." "I am counting on it," Edmund said. I expect you to be right about them at a rate of approximately 70%, which is better than anyone else in my acquaintance. 70, she said. That is generous. It is honest, he said. You were wrong about the left flank angle on the shooting sketch. You corrected it immediately, which is its own kind of accuracy. He paused. I intend to be wrong sometimes, too. I imagine you will tell me. I imagine I will, she said. And then she said yes, which she had perhaps decided on Thursday morning in the library, when he brought out the drainage ledgers without being asked, and sat across the table from her like a man who had found something he hadn't known he was looking for, and which she had spent the subsequent days examining from every angle, as was her method. I came in from the kitchen wall in time to see Edmund offer her his arm, which she took, and to see his face, which was the face I had not been able to name on Wednesday evening. I can name it now. It was relief. The relief of a man who has been governed by his father's voice for 36 years, and has just discovered, in a frost-bitten garden in October, that the voice was wrong about the only thing that mattered, and that he got there in time. Mrs. Plumtree had to be told the carriage would not be needed until tomorrow, and she wept a little, and said she had always known, and that Renshaw Hall was a great opportunity, which she had said 3 times on Tuesday and was saying again now, and this time she was not wrong. The Dowager, when Edmund told her, said simply, "Well," and looked at her son with an expression that was not surprise and was not triumph, and was something a great deal quieter than either. She had been trying for 8 years. She had finally brought the right person to the right garden. Edmund and Cecily were married that following spring, in the small church at the edge of the Renshaw estate, with the kitchen garden behind the south wall already putting out its first rosemary of the season. I stood beside him, as I always have, and watched her come up the aisle with the composure she brought to everything. The same composure she had brought to a dinner table on Wednesday evening when a duke had said a foolish thing, and she had asked, pleasantly, a follow-up question. She was in ivory, not white. She had, apparently, opinions about the distinction, and Edmund had told her, apparently, that she was right about it, which she was. There were herbs from Duff's garden woven into what she carried, which was her own idea and which Duff considered an honor. I stood beside Edmund at the altar, and he did not check his pocket watch, which surprised no one. He watched her come up the aisle with the expression I had finally named in the kitchen garden on Sunday morning, the expression that was relief. And beneath the relief was something that had no particular name, except that it was what a man looks like when he has found the person he did not know he was looking for, and found them in 4 days in October in a cold kitchen garden where the sage had gone silver with frost. She arrived beside him. She looked at him directly, as she always had. He offered her his hand. She took it in the manner of a woman who has decided, and who knows what she has decided, and who does not perform the decision but simply makes it. I thought, she will correct him for 40 years, and he will be right at a rate of 70% because she will make him better at it, and he will bring her drainage ledgers in libraries, and she will sketch the geometry of every morning worth seeing, and Renshaw Hall will be warmer for it in ways it has never been warmer in all the years I have visited. The cold corridors, the high-ceilinged rooms, the library where his father's voice had lived in the margins of the books, waiting to be questioned. She had questioned it pleasantly over consommé. He had proposed by Sunday. The Dowager sat in the front pew and did not weep, because she was a Renshaw woman and did not perform feeling, but she held her hands very still in her lap throughout the service in the way of someone keeping a great and quiet happiness from showing, and I noted it, because I note everything. And I, who witnessed the whole of it from the dining table to the kitchen garden to the altar rail, and who said nothing to anyone for 30 years, can tell you now with complete authority. He was the only man in England who knew what he was asking for when he proposed in that frost-bitten garden, because she had shown him precisely, across 4 days of argument and drainage systems and morning frost, what a woman with opinions actually was. The most valuable thing in the world, it turns out. He just needed 4 days to work it out.